Alright, these are artists who have made several albums and have also, contributed a lot to music and tried many different kinds of music. The Beach Boys, Concert, 1964. 2 copies. Best of the Beach Boys, 1966. Best of the Beach Boys, Volume 2, 1967. 2 copies. The Beach Boys, Smiley Smile, 1967. The Beach Boys, Wild Honey, 1967. Best of the Beach Boys, Volume 3, 1968. The Beach Boys in Concert, 1973. The Beach Boys, Endless Summer, 1974. The Beach Boys, Spirit of America, 1975. The Beach Boys, 20 Golden Greats, 1976. The Beach Boys, self-titled album, 1985. With the Beatles, 1963. Introducing the Beatles, 1964. Meet the Beatles, 1964. Something New by the Beatles, 1964. Hear the Beatles Tell All, 1964. Beatles 65, 1964, no cover, in mono. The Early Beatles, 1965. Beatles 6, 1965. The Beatles Help, no cover, along with Sgt. Pepper, 65 and 67. The Beatles Help, 1965. The Beatles Rubber Soul, 1965. The Beatles Yesterday and Today, 1966. The Beatles Revolver, US version, 1966. Another copy. The Beatles Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967. That was a mono copy, the rest are all in stereo. The Beatles Magical Mystery Tour, 1967. 2 copies. The Beatles self-titled album, The White Album, 1968. Serial number. Later pressing from the 70s. The Beatles Yellow Submarine, British packaging, 1969. The Beatles Abbey Road, 1969. That's a British copy. The rest are all American copies. That one doesn't have a jacket, unfortunately. The Beatles Hey Jude, 1970. The Beatles Let It Be, 3 copies, 1970. The Beatles, 1962 to 1966, 1973. 1967 to 1970 by the Beatles, 1973 as well. And that copy is the blue vinyl edition. I will show you that very quickly. Carefully. There it is, blue vinyl. The Beatles, Rock and Roll Music, 1976. The Beatles, Live at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany, 1962, released in 1977. The Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl, also released in 1977. The Beatles Rarities, 1980. John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, 1970. John Lennon Imagine, 1971. Another copy. John Lennon Mind Games, 1973. John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Double Fantasy, 1980. 3 copies of that. The John Lennon Collection, 1982. Paul McCartney, 1970. 2 copies of that album. Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney, Ram, 1971, 3 copies. Paul McCartney and Wings, Wildlife, 1971, just credit to Wings. Paul McCartney and Wings, Red Rose Speedway, 1973. Paul McCartney and Wings, Band on the Run, 1973. 2 copies. Venus and Mars by Paul McCartney and Wings, 1975. This time just credit to Wings. Wings at the Speed of Sound, 1976. Wings Over America, also 1976. Wings, London Town, 1978. 2 copies. Wings, Back to the Egg, 1979. McCartney 2 by just Paul McCartney, no jacket. The McCartney Interview, 1981. Paul McCartney, Tug of War, 1982. Paul McCartney, Flowers in the Dirt, 1989. 2 copies of that album as well. George Harrison, self-titled album, 1979. George Harrison, Cloud 9, 1987. Ringo Starr, Ringo, 1973. Bob Dylan, Nashville Skyline, 1969. Bob Dylan, Desire, 1979. 2 copies. The Byrds' Greatest Hits, 1967. Fresh Cream, 1966. U.S. copy, of course. Cream, Disraeli Gears, 1967. Cream, Wheels of Fire, 1968. Goodbye Cream, 1969. Best of Cream, 1969. David Bowie, Space Oddity, 1972. David Live, 1974. Donovan, For Little Ones, 1967. Donovan's Greatest Hits, 1969.